Every offseason, we're subjected to Chicago Bears storylines, narratives, and headlines that don't ultimately prove to be true, or at the very least, not nearly as real or as serious as we were led to believe.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we look at some of the biggest overblown stories of the offseason about the Chicago Bears that we spent weeks or months wondering about, talking about, or trying to ignore that really didn't ultimately pan out, that we may either knew at the front end it wouldn't be a big deal, or we learned after a while that it wasn't a big deal, and we kind of were able to move on with our lives. And as a result, I like to look back at these so that we can be more prepared for them in the future and kind of catch when, hey, maybe we're getting strung along here, or maybe we're paying too much attention on the wrong things when these types of things pop up inevitably every offseason. Obviously, this year, it was all about the quarterback position, and there were a couple of key narratives really happening parallel, at the same time this offseason with Justin Fields and with Caleb Williams, that I think both of which ended up not really being a true or not really being a big deal either way. With Justin Fields, we heard teammates talk about how much support he had in the locker room, that, guys were backing him. And there was this feeling like, oh no, could the Chicago Bears locker room withstand a Justin Fields departure? If the Bears trade Justin Fields, are they going to be able to, keep everyone together? Are players going to be mad and going to be upset? There are people in the building that support Fields and want the Bears to keep Fields, and his teammates are going to be mad if he's gone because he was such a good leader in the locker room and everyone loved and supported him. And could that be a factor in the Chicago Bears quarterback decision? And obviously, teammates did like Justin Fields. Of course, there's truth to what's behind that as a narrative, right? That yes, teammates did support Justin Fields and he was well liked in the locker room, and all those things are true. But where it stops is when you move on from Justin Fields. There's some factual foundation here, but then the sort of narrative that spun off of the factual foundation here of locker room likes Fields, true. So therefore, locker room will be furious and a mess when you get rid of Fields, not true, right? That's where the distinction was separated here. And certainly I'm sure there were teammates that weren't super happy when they moved on from Justin Fields. And I'm sure there were some hard feelings that needed to be smoothed over, but we haven't seen any evidence whatsoever of players being overly upset or that the departure of losing Justin Fields has caused any real lingering problems whatsoever. And we kind of knew on the front end that this is a business and players will understand. And to be fair, Jalen Johnson came out and said, yeah, I think the locker room can handle this. It'll be okay. It wasn't like the narrative was completely one-sided here, but it was a lingering storyline throughout this offseason of how will this locker room absorb the loss of Justin Fields? And then on the flip side, you had that simultaneously with narratives about what Caleb Williams might be like in this locker room instead of Justin Fields. That not only will they be mad at whoever comes in to replace Justin Fields because he's not Justin Fields, but also, is Caleb Williams the leader that the Bears need? Can he command a locker room that way? Of course, there was a lot of nonsense about him painting his fingernails and crying on the sideline of the USC game, and whether that's going to be something that this Bears locker room can handle, or whether he is mentally prepared for the NFL, and can he adjust to a pro locker room after, being the big man on campus at USC and Oklahoma before that. And that, oh no, he might come to Chicago, and are the veterans going to have trouble connecting with Caleb Williams? And will there be a bigger adjustment period there that causes more problems? And once again, it's certainly early. It's only been, 2 months of Caleb Williams as a Chicago Bear, but no evidence whatsoever of any kind of problems of teammates with Caleb Williams, of Caleb adjusting to Chicago, of adjusting to the locker room, of getting along with veterans, of any part of that process. He has been able to endear himself to his teammates quickly. Players seem to be buying in and building that chemistry very, very quickly and rallying around him to the point where, already at press conferences, it kind of feels like, yeah, Caleb's one of the leaders. Like, he's just one of the guys at the front of the room. And we know, he kind of went through the process of doing more listening than talking, and he's not instantly, hey, everyone, look at me, I'm in charge, everyone get in line, but that clearly over, between rookie mini camps and then voluntary OTAs and then mandatory mini camps, his voice has gotten louder in this locker room and his role has gotten more and more established, despite still not having signed his rookie contract throughout that entire process, which will be interesting. But I think, coming into training camp, he's very clearly already among the top leaders in that locker room, and that there's no major disconnect. There's no major transition issues from a leadership standpoint or any of that stuff. And certainly I think throughout the offseason, that narrative started to debunk a little bit as more and more came out from Caleb's teammates and coaches, that every teammate you ever heard from and every coach you ever heard from only had great things to say about what Caleb was like at USC and how he was able to lead that team through some serious moments of adversity. So that was one where I don't know that there was a ton of factual foundation to back up that narrative. It felt more like some kind of fear-mongering or unfair assumptions or judgments based on very limited information or very small sample size of a moment here or a moment there that wasn't more reflective of the larger equation of how Caleb Williams interacts with teammates and all the things that happen that we don't get to see in the locker room, on off the field. All of that communication, Caleb is clearly very good at and is already having a pretty strong effect to that regard in Chicago. So we really got both quarterback situations driven with some narratives here that I think we tried here on the Locked On Bears podcast to kind of cut through on the front end and say, no, I think they'll be fine in both regards, but it was still something that was hard to avoid or hard to ignore or not at least see headlines or see social media posts or hear on sports radio or certainly other podcasts that can get too caught up in all of the stuff that doesn't really end up panning out. And hopefully it could be a lesson for future quarterback off seasons to not get too caught up in a lot of that stuff that doesn't really have a lot of substantiated basis behind it. The same thing was true going into free agency. A lot of noise about what the Chicago Bears would do in free agency. And I would think by now we have some evidence or enough evidence of how Ryan Poles likes to handle the free agent situations that we could maybe get ahead of this and be a little bit better at it. But I don't think we were quite this year. But maybe now that we've seen it again, we can kind of settle in on where the hype started getting a little more out of control in free agency and where the Bears ultimately ended up landing instead. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking about superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Seems like every year the Bears have had a bunch of salary cap space. And entering free agency, we get ourselves hyped up and probably too excited about all the possibilities of what Ryan Poles is going to be able to do in free agency. All of the top targets that you want to see the team go after. And it's helped too that like the team has had holes to fill and to say, okay, like you need to sign one of these and one of these and one of these and one of those. And oh man, we can go get the big name guy here and the big name guy there. And I think there was a lot of talk with some basis to it about the Bears going out and making big splash free agent signings this offseason. And I don't think of DeAndre Swift and Kevin Byard as big splash free agent signings. Maybe DeAndre Swift is like a medium splash, but not a big splash. This was not the top running back contract that was given out. This was not the top safety contract that was given out. These were not the biggest names on the free agent market. This wasn't Ryan Poles landing the big fish. It can be fish that you're excited about and fish you're still going to hold up and take a picture with and say, hey, look at the fish I caught. But it's not the big fishes in free agency here. And yet we were building up towards that for like the second straight or maybe even the third straight offseason. Like there were a lot of articles and headlines about, Bears free agent targets and Bears interest in players. And a lot of them were the top guys available on the market at a bunch of key positions for the Chicago Bears, including, another running back like Saquon Barkley. There was a lot of should the Bears sign Saquon Barkley conversations this offseason. They had the cap space. They could use the running back upgrade potentially. Ended up getting Swift instead, but like Barkley was going to be a big potential addition for them that a lot of people were clamoring for, that whether it was going to be Fields and Barkley in the backfield or Caleb Williams and Barkley in the backfield, like that would be a really fun combination for this offense. Ultimately not the direction Ryan Poles decided to go. And okay, maybe you could say, well, running back wasn't a huge need, so they're not going to make the big splash there. But like, boy, we spent a lot of time this offseason talking about defensive linemen the Chicago Bears might want to go after in free agency because defensive line is such a big need on this roster. A lot of talk about Danielle Hunter from the Minnesota Vikings as being maybe the top target among the edge rushers there, at least the edge rushers that actually hit the market and became available. There was reported interest there that perhaps the Bears had engaged in some negotiations with Danielle Hunter, and that's where like the narrative isn't like totally false. I just think we now know how Ryan Poles operates in free agency and don't need to get ourselves, too excited or too ahead of ourselves or fool ourselves a little bit like in future free agency periods. Like, yes, the Ryan Poles was reportedly negotiating with Danielle Hunter, but Danielle Hunter ends up taking a much, much bigger contract, I think, than what the Bears were interested in to go to the Houston Texans. And that's fine. But like, that's how Ryan Poles operates here. Like, same thing with Christian Wilkins at defensive tackle. Like, a lot of Bears fans wanted them to go out and get Christian Wilkins to be that key interior 3-technique pass rusher. Would have been great for them. It is still a big need on this roster, arguably. But, the Raiders end up going and paying a pretty penny for a top free agent, and the Bears just don't end up really getting involved in the bidding war. Chris Jones, I guess, never really became a realistic option for them, but that was another one where all offseason, it's like, oh, are the Chicago Bears going to be able to get Chris Jones from the Kansas City Chiefs? There's the Ryan Poles connections back to the Chiefs. Like, maybe the Chiefs will let him walk and the Bears can go out and spend big money on this key position that maybe comes with a little bit less risk because you already had the familiarity with Ryan Poles in Kansas City, so it's more like a safer signing. But of course, that never was really an option for the Bears. Or even, Chase Young was in this conversation as well, pairing him back with Montez Sweat in Chicago. He was available, a little bit more affordable than some of the other big options. But like, once again, this offseason, it doesn't happen. Ryan Poles doesn't opt to go blow a bunch of salary cap space on any one individual free agent. And I think now that we've seen this exact same type of thing play out 2 off seasons in a row, I should hope that we kind of understand this is how Ryan Poles goes about free agency moving forward, whether he has a bunch of salary cap space or not. Because you think back to like last offseason, like 2 years, or like a year ago, but 2 off seasons ago, technically, if we're done with this offseason, entering free agency that year, there was negotiations with Mike McGlinchey, the offensive tackle the Bears were going after to get a big tackle and ultimately lets him go somewhere else and cost more money for the Broncos. They were negotiating with defensive linemen like Draymond Jones and Zach Allen, who both got big contracts from the Broncos and the Seahawks, if I remember correctly. Like, there were like 3 or 4 or 5 of these big name free agents that the Bears were linked to by credible reports and that Ryan Poles was pursuing in some way, shape, or form. But with those contracts, eventually kind of said, you know what? We have a certain price that we're willing to pay for these players, and we're not going to overpay for them. And if you can get more money from one of these other teams, by all means, we're not just going to blow all of our cap space just because we really need to have this one guy. We'll pivot to our other options. And I think that's how the Bears approached it this season, where I would bet that they were legitimately talking to Danielle Hunter. But once that contract got to a certain number, they're out, and they're not going to just go spend all that cash on another edge rusher after having given Montez Sweat such a huge contract. So, like, they pursued it. They pursued the big name free agents. It's not that Ryan Poles is never actually interested in them, but I think we end up getting a little bit too far ahead of ourselves when we start putting jersey swaps of Danielle Hunter or Saquon Barkley in a Bears uniform. Like, instead, we get the DeMarcus Walkers of the world and the Kevin Byards and the DeAndre Swifts and the Gerald Everett. Like, Ryan Poles ends up usually coming back to more of the like mid-level free agents that can still be effective players on your team and can still be valuable signings, but don't have nearly as much risk and financial investment involved in them, so that if for some reason that free agent signing doesn't work out, you're a little less stuck and a little less hamstrung by how much money you have invested in those players. Like, we're feeling that a little bit with Nate Davis right now, but because his contract was a little bit more backloaded and he's been struggling a little bit more in this process, but they can move on from him after this season if they want to. Like, there's enough protection built in there because you didn't have to give him the top of the market contract value where they've got all the leverage and they're demanding, so much guaranteed money in so many years that you're really locked into that contract for better or worse as the rest of their deal plays out. So, like, hopefully, based on how Ryan Poles has done multiple free agent classes now, we can be excited about the options that are available to them, but realistic about how Ryan Poles approaches free agency as the general manager of this team. He certainly hasn't been afraid to go make the big splash trades for Keenan Allen or DJ Moore, et cetera, Montez Sweat. Like, he'll make the big trade. It's just the big free agent signings that he ultimately doesn't end up going all in on and blowing a bunch of salary cap space in. So, like, next offseason, we'll make sure we're focusing on some of the mid-tier free agents and not getting too, high, our heads up in the sky on the big expensive guys that the Bears just won't fight in a bidding war to ultimately come back and get. So that's where I think it's a little bit of an overblown narrative storyline about the free agent options and the salary cap space, because it ultimately doesn't really end up playing out all that well. We've also gotten thrown around a little bit this offseason with dueling narratives and storylines and headlines about the Bears stadium process. I don't even know what noun to use there. The stadium saga, if you will, where the narrative on this has shifted back and forth multiple times. And I think we're sort of on the boy who cried wolf here, landing somewhere in the middle where it's like, all right, let's just wait and see at this point, because I don't know if anybody knows exactly which direction this is going to go. But we'll kind of catch up on that saga and how the storylines in both directions have been overblown and how the Bears have kind of done that intentionally throughout this process. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy that's here to help you be your best self. I do online therapy every single week, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen, and it's why I can't recommend BetterHelp enough, because it's really so helpful for myself. Like, I like to say, going to therapy is like going to the gym, but for my brain, right? I go to the gym because I want my body to be its strongest, not because it's broken and needs fixing, but just because I want it to be its best. And I think of therapy the same way for me. Like, it's not that my brain is broken, but I want to be as mentally healthy as I possibly can and to be the best version of myself. So if you've been thinking about giving therapy a try, check out BetterHelp. It's entirely online, and it's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. As they say, stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We've been sold a couple of bills of goods on this Bears stadium planning and project throughout this offseason that has swung, I think, wildly in both directions. And I think by now, I would hope we're all kind of on to the game here on how exactly this works. And I think we've sort of seen this all along, but Bears have been coy enough about it where they've led you to believe, well, maybe they are serious in this direction, or maybe they are serious in that direction. But like now, I think most of their cards are on the table at this point, and now it's sort of a waiting game of how both sides get there for the Bears. But for example, they buy the Arlington Heights site. The Arlington Park is the name of the actual site, the municipality, Arlington Heights, and that's seems to be the plan, right? The Bears want to build this whole entertainment district in Arlington Heights. That was the whole story, all the headlines, the narrative. Bears moving to, they weren't officially moving to Arlington Heights, but that was the story, right? Arlington Heights was where this team was going to be. And even as recently as this week, we still get updates about what's going on with Arlington Heights, and that is certainly still an option for the team on the table. But for a long time, it was, all right, Arlington Heights site, moving forward, they're working with the local municipal government there. I don't know if it's a city council or whatever the board is that works on that stuff, and trying to work through the property tax situation and other potential tax incentives for the Bears to build a stadium there. And that was the plan. And negotiations had fallen apart with the city of Chicago. And at the time, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, there was a pretty big disconnect there, it seemed, between the Bears and the city of Chicago leadership there. So it was all in on Arlington Heights. But then, time goes on and there's some disagreement about the assessed value of the property in Arlington. And we're not going to get too in the weeds on, municipal financing here, but the idea being the Bears want the city to say that the property is not very valuable, so that the property taxes will be lower on the property. But the city's assessor put out a pretty high, said, no, this property is actually worth a lot of money. And so therefore, we're going to tax it based on what it's worth. It's the same percentage, but it's the same percentage of a higher number, but the Bears want that number to be a lower number, so they're not paying as much in taxes on that site. And they're fighting with the city about, well, no, we think the property is only worth this much, and the city thinks the property is worth more. And it's a funny thing when the Bears buy a property and then argue it's worth less. But that's how you save money, and it's to the tune of millions of dollars in this process. So it matters quite a bit. And now we're still getting headlines about, they're working on settling on, okay, maybe we can meet somewhere in the middle on how much this property is worth. But even as recently as this week, the Arlington Heights mayor is saying that they're in a good place with the Bears and they're working towards this, despite so much of the narrative having flipped when the Bears released their big plans for what a downtown stadium would look like. The Bears, they had that big presentation. Here's what the stadium would be just south of the current Soldier Field, over where the parking is right now, and plans to build it and what it would look like as a state-of-the-art facility. And the Bears said, our focus is building on the lakefront. Our focus is downtown Chicago. And all of a sudden we do this massive swing from Arlington Heights is the thing and to nope, okay, downtown Chicago, we're putting a stadium right by Soldier Field. We want to be in downtown. We want to stay in downtown. If you can just give us a few $1 billion, city of Chicago, then we'll be happy to stay right here downtown where you want us, and where I think the Bears honestly do want to be. Ideally, if all other things were equal, they would want to be downtown and be right where they are on the lakefront there. But then you get, Governor Pritzker, and I think the mayor as well, kind of both said, hey, we don't have billions of dollars to give you, and plus, the White Sox are also looking for billions of dollars for their stadium. So hey, we'd love to have you here, but we're not going to give you all that money. And so the Bears still say that they're generally focused on a downtown site, but we're not selling the Arlington Heights property. Kevin Warren says, no, we're not going to sell that. Not yet. Our primary focus is downtown, but we're not going to sell Arlington Heights. And so now we've seen the narrative swing drastically, right? From one direction to the other. And now it's starting to come back a little bit. And I think you can start to see what the Bears are doing here, how they're playing the leverage game, right? So they buy the Arlington Heights property, sincerely interested in moving out there, and they go to Arlington Heights and they say, hey, we're interested in making this multi-billion-dollar investment in your city, and look at all the business that having the Chicago Bears there is going to do for you. We would be such a benefit to your city. Please give us a lot of tax incentives to build there and make this as easy as possible for us and, sort of cut some of the red tape there and make this the best process it can be for us, and we will gladly move to Arlington Heights. And I think the city of Arlington Heights said, great, we'd love to have you, but hold on, we can't just fork over a bunch of money. We're also still not a small town, but this is not downtown Chicago either. They don't just have billions and billions of dollars or anything to throw at them. So then the Bears went to Arlington Heights and were like, hey, can you give us stuff? And Arlington Heights says, we'll give you some. And the Bears go, that's not as much as we wanted or as much as we were hoping for here. So they go back to the city of Chicago and they say, hey, city of Chicago, we really like Arlington Heights, but if you guys would give us stuff, we'd consider coming there. And of course you get a new mayor, Brandon Johnson, instead of Lori Lightfoot, so they can kind of reestablish some connections there. And then all of a sudden the city seems a lot more willing to work with the Bears, and Arlington Heights isn't at the time. So the Bears say, all right, we are focused in going downtown. Arlington Heights isn't giving us what we want. Let's go downtown Chicago. Let's go to the lakefront. We'll build a big stadium there. And the city of Chicago will give us the money, right? You're Chicago. You've got all sorts of space and money, not open space, but you know what I mean? So much tax income comes from Chicago. You can give us some of that to keep the Chicago Bears in Chicago. And the city and the governor say, well, hold on, maybe not so fast. Maybe we don't have that much money to give you. This is kind of a non-starter. We can't just give all this money to the stadium. You're a rich NFL team. Build it yourselves. So now the Bears go back to Arlington Heights and say, okay, can we meet somewhere in the middle on where we were? And all this is just a leverage play, right? Of okay, who's going to give us more of what we want? We'll be interested in Arlington Heights. We'll be interested in downtown Chicago. We'll take legitimate steps in both directions. We'll release these big plans for both of them and say, see how great this would be for Arlington Heights and see how great this would be for the city of Chicago. Now, which one of you wants to give us more money? Which one of you will help us out more in making this stadium? And I think all along that was the plan, right? Initially, they're pretending, hey, we're all in on Arlington Heights to try and pressure the city of Chicago to give them stuff. Well, then Arlington Heights doesn't give them stuff, so they go back to the city of Chicago to try and pressure Arlington Heights into giving them stuff. And now it feels like all the cards are on the table where it's all right, we've got these two great plans. We'd be happy at either site. Governor's kind of telling us no. Arlington Heights is kind of telling us no. So where can we compromise with either side here to find the right deal? And so I think the takeaway for me from the narratives of the stadium stuff is we don't know. I think the Bears are legitimately focused on and would prefer the downtown site. I think that's probably more likely right now if I had to bet my money on it. But I think the Bears would still go down either path if either side would give them the opportunity. So I'm not going to sit here today and get caught up in either direction and be like, oh, they're going to move or oh, they're not. I think we just got to wait because they're going to keep playing this back and forth game until someone gives them enough of what they want, and then they can lock in and move forward with new stadium plans. So that's where each side of that got overblown. I don't think they were ever all in on Arlington Heights, and I don't think they were ever all in on the downtown Chicago, but they wanted to give us that impression and give the other side that impression so that they would come to the negotiating table and give the Bears more of what they want. So that's where it's easy to get kind of caught up in an overblown narrative that I think the Bears were they wanted both sides to think they were all in on the other side, but now all the cards are on the table and they know that both of these options are available, and now it's just the sort of municipal government bidding war on who can get the Chicago Bears or give them more of what they want. If we get a major progress update in this stadium story, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day we try and avoid the overblown narratives, headlines, and storylines and try and cut through it and get you the real truth of what's going on around this team. And I hope along the way, each podcast gives you another opportunity to bear down.